The Texas sun was sinking low, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. The wind moved softly through the dry grass, whispering stories of danger and pride. On that lonely road near the Rio Grande, every man knew one name: King Fisher. He was not born a king, but he ruled his corner of the Wild West through fear, charm, and a restless kind of courage that made others follow him or stay far away. To some, he was a criminal. To others, a legend. And like every legend, his story began with pain. John King Fisher was born in October 1853 in Collin County, Texas. Life was rough even for ordinary folks back then. But for a boy like him, it was harder still. His mother died when he was very young, leaving a hole in his heart that never quite healed. His father, Job Fisher, tried to keep the family together, moving them closer to Austin after the Civil War. Texas was changing fast. Broken laws, broken men, and broken dreams filled the land. Young John grew up watching both cowboys and outlaws carve their names into history with bullets and blood. He was a quiet boy at first, but by his teenage years he was quick with his fists and quicker with a smile. People liked him. They said he had a spark in his eyes that could light up a room or start a fire. That spark led him into trouble more than once. One day he was caught stealing a horse. In the Wild West, that was no small thing. It could get a man hanged. He was arrested and sent to jail, but he was still just a boy. The court gave him a second chance. He left the jailhouse a free man, but something had changed. The walls of that cell taught him a cruel lesson. In Texas, freedom belonged to the strongest. When John walked out, he carried a new name, King Fisher. No one knew exactly how he earned it. Some said it came from his proud walk, others from the way he ruled his world like a bird of prey. Whatever the reason, the name stuck, and so did the attitude. By the early 1870s, he found his way to the wild borderlands of southwest Texas, near the Rio Grande. It was a place of dust and danger, where lawmen rarely came and bandits ruled the night. There, he built a small ranch on Pendencia Creek. But it wasn't just a ranch, it was a hideout. Fisher gathered a group of tough men, cowboys, drifters, and desperate souls who would do anything for money. They called themselves his crew, but most people called them what they were: outlaws. They stole cattle, raided villages across the Mexican border, and moved stolen goods back into Texas. The region between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande became their playground, and King Fisher was the man who set the rules. At the entrance to his ranch, he posted a wooden sign that read, "This is King Fisher's road, take the other one." It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. But even outlaws have codes. Fisher's men lived by his. He demanded loyalty, fairness, and silence. You steal, you pay. You lie, you die, he told them. He didn't harm innocent locals, and he gave food to poor families nearby. In a strange way, the people around him respected him, maybe even feared him a little less than they feared others. Fisher dressed sharp, bright vests, silver buttons, and twin ivory-handled pistols resting on his hips. When he rode into town, people stepped aside. Not because he shouted or threatened, but because his very presence filled the air with tension. He didn't brag. He didn't boast. He didn't need to. Still, trouble followed him everywhere. One story tells that after a fight over stolen cattle, Fisher's men argued about how to divide the loot. In a flash, he shot 3 of them dead and buried them right there on the plains. Another tale claims that he once fought off 8 Mexican bandits by himself. Maybe those stories grew larger with every telling. Maybe they were true. In the Wild West, truth and legend often rode the same horse. Yet behind the fierce eyes and the fast draw, there was something deeper. Some said King Fisher wanted more than gold and glory. He wanted respect. He wanted to be remembered. Perhaps that's why, even as he lived outside the law, he tried to make his own rules of justice. He never robbed travelers. He treated women kindly. And he kept order in his little kingdom the only way he knew, with fear. As the years passed, whispers spread through Texas. King Fisher doesn't kill for pleasure. He kills for principle. And though few believed it, the legend grew. One evening, while standing on his porch, Fisher watched the sun go down over Pendencia Creek. The cattle grazed quietly, and the wind carried the scent of dust and mesquite. He looked out across the land he controlled and realized something. His empire was built on sand. Sooner or later, every outlaw met a sheriff faster than his gun, or a bullet he didn't see coming. But Fisher's story wasn't over yet. Destiny had a strange plan for him. The outlaw would soon wear a badge. The thief would become a lawman, and for a brief, shining moment, the king of the border would try to become a man of honor. That transformation, his fight to change, to build a new life, would make John Kingfisher one of the most fascinating figures in all of Wild West history. Some men are born heroes, others become legends. But a few, like Kingfisher, walk the line between both. The year was 1873. The Texas borderlands were wild, wide, and full of danger. Dust storms swept across the plains, and gunfire was never far away. Out here, justice came from the barrel of a gun. And in this harsh land, Kingfisher was becoming a name everyone whispered, sometimes in fear, sometimes in admiration. He was only in his 20s, but he already carried himself like a man who had lived a dozen lives. His ranch on Pendencia Creek near the Rio Grande had become a stronghold. People said you could see his men riding in every direction, guarding cattle, herding stolen horses, and watching for intruders. It was more than a hideout. It was the heart of his power. At the time, the area between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande was a gray zone, neither fully under Texas law nor completely controlled by Mexico. Bandits crossed the border freely. Smugglers, gun runners, and cattle thieves made fortunes in the chaos. Kingfisher fit perfectly into that world. He was fearless, clever, and dangerously charming. Men followed him because he offered something no one else could: protection and profit. Under Fisher's command, raids were planned like military missions. His gang rode under the moonlight, crossed into Mexico, and drove herds of cattle back to Texas. They sold them to buyers who didn't ask too many questions. The money came fast, and so did the bloodshed. But Kingfisher wasn't like the ordinary outlaws. He had rules. He didn't allow his men to harm women, children, or the poor. Anyone who broke that code faced his judgment, and his judgment was swift. One story tells how he shot one of his own men for mistreating a farmer's family. To Fisher, reputation mattered more than riches. He once said, "A man who can't keep order in his own camp doesn't deserve to lead it." And he meant every word. Despite his rough world, Fisher loved fine clothes. He wore tailored jackets, bright silk shirts, and 2 shining pistols with ivory handles resting on his hips. His dark hair was slicked back, and a confident grin often played across his face. When he rode into town, heads turned. Some townsfolk said he looked more like a gambler than a gunslinger. Others said he looked like trouble wrapped in a fancy coat. He often spent nights in the saloons of Eagle Pass or Uvalde, where whiskey, music, and poker filled the air. Yet even in the middle of laughter, there was tension, because everyone knew that if someone crossed Kingfisher, the night could end in gunfire. But beneath the charm and danger was something deeper, a man trying to fill the empty spaces of his life with excitement, respect, and maybe redemption. Fisher's legend grew with every story told around campfires. One tale said that Mexican bandits once tried to attack his ranch at night. Fisher woke his men, grabbed his rifle, and rode straight into the attackers. By dawn, 8 bandits were dead, and the rest had fled across the border. Another claimed that when 2 of his men betrayed him during a raid, he tracked them for days and dealt with them himself. No trial, no mercy. Each story, whether true or not, painted the same picture: a man no one dared to cross. In a world full of outlaws, Fisher stood apart. He wasn't the loudest or the meanest. He was the one who meant what he said. And that made him dangerous. Even lawmen started to treat him differently. Rangers who might have hunted others down often looked the other way when it came to Kingfisher. Some even shared drinks with him. They knew he could be an ally or an enemy, and neither option was safe. Yet behind all the swagger and violence, Fisher was still human. He felt loneliness like any man. The endless fighting, the constant watching over his shoulder, the fear that every sunrise might be his last, it wore on him. Sometimes, when the nights were quiet, he would sit by the fire, listening to the crickets, thinking about the mother he lost, the boy he once was, and the peace he might never find. But peace had no place in the Nueces Strip. One day, as he watched the river flow, he told a friend, "A man's got to choose who he is. The world won't wait for him to decide." At that moment, Fisher was choosing to be the king of chaos, and though the money kept coming, so did the enemies. Mexican ranchers, rival gangs, and even Texas lawmen began to see him as a problem that needed solving. He didn't know it yet, but the walls were starting to close in. By the mid-1870s, the border was changing. The Texas Rangers were becoming more organized. The U.S. Army had started patrols to control raiders. The space where Fisher ruled so freely was shrinking. He could feel it. The life he built on fear and fame wouldn't last forever. Still, he wasn't the kind of man to run. He would face what came, guns blazing if necessary. But fate had something else in store. It wasn't bullets that would change King Fisher's life. It was love. In the spring of 1876, a woman named Sarah Vivian entered his life. She was kind, strong, and unafraid of him. Unlike others, she saw not just the outlaw, but the man beneath the legend. And for the first time, King Fisher began to wonder if he could ever live a normal life. He married Sarah that same year. Together they built a home and started a family. The wild nights began to fade into quieter days. He still carried his guns, but now he carried hope too. The outlaw who ruled by fear was slowly learning the meaning of peace. But peace in the Wild West never lasts long. He had conquered the border with a gun, but soon he would face the greatest battle of all, his fight to change. The sun rose over the Texas plains, spilling gold across the hills and pastures that once echoed with gunfire. For the first time in years, King Fisher wasn't riding with outlaws or planning raids. He was waking up beside his wife, Sarah Vivian, and hearing the laughter of their daughters. It was a sound that softened him, a sound he never thought he would live to hear. Fisher had married Sarah in 1876. She was strong and graceful, with steady eyes that could quiet the storm in his soul. Where others saw an outlaw, she saw a man trying to find peace. She believed he could change, and somehow he began to believe it too. Together they built a home near Uvalde, Texas, far from the dusty borderlands that had shaped his legend. The nights of whiskey and gunfire were replaced by nights of family, laughter, and quiet dreams of a better life. For a while, it seemed as if the past had loosened its grip on him. He bought cattle, fixed fences, and worked hard to become a real rancher. The hands that once held guns now held tools, ropes, and the reins of his own redemption. But peace didn't come easily to a man with his kind of name. Every town he visited still carried whispers. That's King Fisher, the man who killed 37 men. Some feared him, others admired him, but few ever trusted him. Still, Fisher didn't run from his reputation. He faced it. When people doubted his change, he showed them through action. When trouble came, he handled it with calm, not rage. And slowly, the lawmen who once hunted him began to respect him. In a land filled with hypocrisy and half-truths, King Fisher kept his word. He didn't promise to be perfect. He only promised to be fair. By the early 1880s, that fairness caught the attention of the local authorities in Uvalde County. They needed someone who could handle the rough men of the region, someone tough enough to be feared but wise enough to keep the peace. There weren't many men who fit that description, but one name stood out: King Fisher. When the offer came, he thought long and hard. He had spent years living on the wrong side of the badge. Could he really wear it with honor now? He looked at his wife, at his daughters playing in the yard, and at the long Texas road that had led him here. The choice was hard but clear. He accepted. The outlaw became a lawman. When King Fisher first pinned that badge to his chest, the town went quiet. People didn't know whether to laugh or to run. But soon his presence began to change things. The troublemakers who used to swagger through Uvalde started keeping their distance. They knew the sheriff was a man who had already walked through hell and come back alive. As sheriff, Fisher ruled with a steady hand. He didn't brag about justice. He simply delivered it. When drunks brawled in the saloon, he broke up the fight without pulling his gun. When cattle thieves tried their luck, he tracked them across the plains until he brought them in. He had a talent for peace because he understood violence better than anyone. And the people, slowly but surely, began to trust him. They called him the man who tamed the border. And for a while, it was true. Under his watch, Uvalde became one of the safest counties in southwest Texas. It was strange how life worked, how the same fire that once burned everything around him was now keeping others safe. Yet even as he wore the badge, Fisher knew the past never truly dies. Every time he heard a gunshot echo in the distance, his heart tightened. Every time a stranger rode into town, he wondered if they came for revenge. There were still men across the Rio Grande who hadn't forgotten the raids, families who hadn't forgiven the blood he spilled. He tried not to think about it, but deep down, he knew that peace built on violence was always fragile. Sometimes, late at night, he sat on the porch, polishing his revolvers. He didn't plan to use them, but he kept them ready. Old habits die hard. Sarah would step outside, place a gentle hand on his shoulder, and whisper, "You've done enough fighting, John." He'd smile softly, eyes on the horizon. "Maybe, but fighting's all I've ever known." He wasn't proud of that truth, but he didn't hide from it either. To him, redemption wasn't about pretending the past never happened. It was about facing it every day and choosing differently. But the world outside Uvalde wasn't as forgiving. The borderlands were still restless. Many once rode with had been killed or captured. Others, bitter and desperate, blamed him for turning against his own kind. They saw his badge as betrayal, and betrayal has a way of attracting bullets. Even so, Fisher stayed true to his new path. He brought order where chaos once reigned, and for a few brief years he lived the life he'd once thought impossible. A husband, a father, a respected lawman. He became living proof that a man could change no matter how dark his past. But in the Wild West, peace was never permanent. The same winds that carried him from outlaw to sheriff were already shifting again. And somewhere out there in the shadows, the ghosts of his old life were waiting. He could almost feel their eyes on him, watching, whispering his name. "King Fisher! King Fisher!" He knew it was only a matter of time before the past came calling. But until that day came, he would ride his land with his head high, his badge gleaming, and his guns resting quietly at his side. The outlaw had become the lawman. The king had built a kingdom of peace, and soon fate would ask him to defend it one last time. In the land of dust and justice, even kings can't escape their past. The Texas sky stretched wide and endless, a sea of burning orange fading into deep blue. Sheriff King Fisher rode alone that evening, the wind brushing through his hair, his badge glinting faintly under the setting sun. The land was quiet, too quiet. And in that silence, the past began to whisper again. He had worked hard to earn peace. For years, he'd been the man who brought order to Uvalde County. People trusted him now. Ranchers greeted him with smiles instead of fear. Children waved when he rode through town. He had a family that adored him, a home full of warmth and laughter. But deep inside, Fisher knew that no man ever truly escapes the shadow of his past. Every outlaw he'd ever faced down, every raid he'd ever led, every life he had taken, they still lived inside his memory like ghosts that refused to rest. He could ride from one end of Texas to the other, but they would always follow. Some nights, when the world grew still, he would sit by the window and stare into the dark plains. Sarah would find him there, lost in thought, the firelight flickering against his face. "What are you thinking about, John?" she would ask softly. He would smile, but his eyes would stay fixed on the horizon. "Just the old days," he'd whisper. They never seemed too far behind. The people of Uvalde saw a calm, respected sheriff. What they didn't see was the weight he carried. Fisher was still a man marked by his reputation. To the law he was redeemed, but to some he was still an outlaw in disguise. There were folks, men he had once fought, rival gangs he had crossed, and families left grieving, who whispered that justice hadn't yet found him. Word began to spread that a few old enemies were looking for him. One of them was a ruthless bandit leader from across the border, whose brother had died in one of Fisher's old raids. Another was a former partner turned rival who blamed Fisher for betraying their gang. They wanted revenge, and they were patient men. Fisher didn't speak about it much, but he knew. He could feel the tension in the air, like thunder waiting to break. He kept his guns close, even when sitting at the dinner table. His daughters laughed at it once, asking why he still wore his pistols at home. He only said, "Because sometimes the past knocks on the door when you least expect it." He wasn't trying to scare them, he was telling them the truth. One afternoon, Fisher was called to a nearby ranch. A group of cattle thieves had crossed the border again, stealing livestock and threatening local ranchers. The law needed someone who knew how to handle men like that. Someone who understood how they thought, how they fought, how they disappeared. King Fisher rode out with a small posse, tracking the thieves across dry riverbeds and cactus-lined hills. The old instincts came rushing back, the sharp eyes, the steady hands, the cold focus that made him a survivor. It had been years since he'd lived like this, but the wild still lived in his blood. When they finally caught up, the thieves tried to run. Fisher gave chase, firing warning shots into the air. The men surrendered without a fight. He brought them back alive, tied and silent, dust clinging to their faces. It was justice without bloodshed, and for Fisher, that felt like victory. But the story spread fast. Whispers filled the saloons that King Fisher still hadn't gone soft. Some said he'd scared the thieves with just his stare. Others claimed he'd threatened to hang them on the spot. None of it was true, but rumors have a way of growing teeth in the Wild West, and somewhere in those whispers, his old enemies listened. A few months later, a letter arrived at Fisher's home. It was unsigned, the handwriting rough and angry. It said only, "You can wear a badge, but you'll never wash the blood off your hands." Sarah found it first. She said nothing, but the fear in her eyes spoke volumes. Fisher burned the letter in the fire that night. He told her it meant nothing, that ghosts couldn't hurt them. But as he watched the paper curl into ash, he felt the old world stirring again, the one he'd tried to bury under peace and family. He began to sense he was being watched. On the roads, he'd catch glimpses of riders far behind him, too distant to recognize. Sometimes, when he closed up the sheriff's office, he'd find boot prints in the dust that weren't his. He didn't talk about it to anyone. Not even Sarah. The fewer people who worried, the better. One evening, as a storm rolled in over Uvalde, Fisher saddled his horse and rode into town. The rain fell hard, drumming against his coat and hat. He stopped by the saloon for a quick drink, nodding politely to the locals who greeted him with respect. But his eyes scanned the room, always alert, always searching. That was the curse of men like him. Peace never meant safety. It only meant the fight hadn't come yet. When he stepped back outside, lightning flashed across the sky, revealing a lone rider watching from the far end of the street. For a brief second, their eyes met. Then the stranger turned and rode off into the storm. Fisher didn't follow. He just stood there, rain soaking his coat, his hand resting quietly on his gun. He didn't know when it would come or who it would be. But he knew one thing for certain. The past had found him again. The thunder rolled across the plains as he rode home that night. The rain washed the dust from the land, but not from his soul. He had traded his outlaw's crown for a badge of honor, but deep down, he understood that no man escapes the Wild West clean. As the lightning flickered across his face, a single thought filled his mind. You can change your path, but you can't change where it began. The storm raged on, and the shadow of King Fisher's past rode with him into the dark. The morning sun burned bright over the Texas hills, washing the land in a soft orange glow. Sheriff King Fisher rode out from Uvalde with calm confidence, his black hat pulled low, his badge glinting on his chest. The sky was clear, the road long, and his thoughts quiet. For now. It had been years since he'd ridden without looking over his shoulder. The world seemed almost peaceful again. He had done his duty, protected his county, raised his family, and tried to build an honest life. But deep inside, he still carried a strange unease, a feeling that something was waiting beyond the horizon. That feeling was right. The month was March 1884, and San Antonio was calling. The city was bigger than the towns Fisher knew, noisy streets, polished saloons, and bright lights that never seemed to dim. It was a place where lawmen and gamblers rubbed shoulders, where outlaws tried to look respectable, and where the past could catch up with you when you least expected it. King Fisher had business there, official, respectable business. But he also had an old friend to meet. His name was Ben Thompson. Ben Thompson was a man a lot like Fisher, brave, reckless, proud, and haunted by his own past. Once a soldier and a gambler, Thompson had seen more duels and shootouts than most men could dream of surviving. The two had met years before and earned each other's respect through shared fire. They were cut from the same rough cloth, men who'd walked through violence, then tried to live among peace. Fisher liked Ben's honesty. He liked that Ben didn't pretend to be more than he was. And Thompson trusted Fisher more than most. So, when word came that Ben wanted to talk, King Fisher saddled his best horse, kissed Sarah on the forehead, and promised he'd be back in a few days. Sarah smiled faintly but didn't hide the worry in her eyes. "Just be careful," she whispered. "You always say it's just business," he laughed softly. "It is. I'll be home before the weekend. He meant it. But destiny had other plans. The ride to San Antonio was long but familiar. The air smelled of spring and mesquite. Coyotes howled in the distance. Along the trail, Fisher passed travelers and traders who tipped their hats when they saw the badge. Some recognized his name and whispered it quietly when he rode past. To most Texans, King Fisher had become a symbol, a man who had crossed the line between sin and salvation, and somehow lived to tell the tale. But fame was a double-edged sword. His name brought respect, and it brought enemies. As the miles passed, old thoughts returned. He remembered the raids, the battles, the faces of men who never came back. He remembered the first time he'd worn the badge, the pride and fear tangled together in his chest. And though he had left his outlaw life behind, he couldn't shake the feeling that the Wild West wasn't quite done with him yet. When San Antonio came into view, its rooftops shimmered in the afternoon light. Fisher slowed his horse, taking in the sight. It was beautiful in a restless kind of way, alive with noise, with danger, with promise. He found a room near the Vaudeville Variety Theater, the place Ben Thompson was known to visit often. The theater was popular among gamblers and gunslingers, a mix of laughter, music, and trouble waiting to happen. That night, Fisher and Thompson met at a saloon nearby. The two men greeted each other with grins, clapped shoulders, and shared a drink. "John," Ben said, his voice rough but warm. "It's been too long, Fisher agreed, raising his glass. "You staying out of trouble?" Ben laughed, a sound that turned a few heads. "You know me. Trouble usually finds me first." The men talked late into the evening. Old stories, old mistakes, the things they'd done and the things they wished they hadn't. For a brief moment, it was like the years had rolled back, and they were just two men chasing the same dream of redemption. But there was tension in Ben's eyes, a storm brewing behind the laughter. He had enemies in town, men who wanted him dead. Fisher knew that look. He'd seen it in mirrors before. "Maybe you should leave," Fisher told him quietly. "This place feels wrong." Ben shook his head. "I've run long enough. If they want me, they'll find me. I'm not hiding," Fisher sighed. "Then I'm not leaving you alone." It was a promise born of loyalty, the kind of promise that would cost him everything. The next day, the city buzzed with energy. The Vaudeville Variety Theater was preparing for a busy night. The lights glowed bright, the band tuned their instruments, and gamblers filled the hallways. Among them were men with cold eyes and quiet hands hovering near their guns. Fisher and Thompson walked through the doors just before sunset. Laughter filled the air, but beneath it was something darker, an unspoken tension that prickled at the edges. The two men took a private box upstairs to watch the show. Fisher leaned back in his chair, uneasy but calm. For a moment it felt almost peaceful. Then the door opened behind them. Voices whispered. Boots scuffed. Metal clicked. Fisher turned his head slightly. He didn't reach for his gun right away. He didn't even stand. He just looked at Ben, who met his gaze with a knowing nod. Whatever was coming, they both knew it was too late to stop it. Outside, thunder rolled softly in the distance, though the sky was clear. The crowd below laughed, unaware of what was about to happen. In the next heartbeat, gunfire erupted. The shots echoed like lightning in the rafters of the theater, and in that instant, the road that began in Collin County, the road that ran through violence, love, law, and redemption, led straight into the storm. King Fisher, the outlaw who became a lawman, had stepped onto his final stage. He came to San Antonio as a sheriff, not a sinner. But in the Wild West, the past always has the last shot. The night of March 11th, 1884 was warm in San Antonio. The streets were alive with the sounds of boots, laughter, and the shuffle of cards inside the Vaudeville Variety Theater. Lamps glowed behind red-curtained windows, and the faint smell of cigar smoke drifted through the air. For most folks, it was just another night of music and drink. But for King Fisher and Ben Thompson, it would be their last. They arrived together just after sunset. Two men who had once walked the razor's edge between outlaw and lawman now stepped into a building filled with both. The Vaudeville was no ordinary theater. It was a place where gamblers, gunfighters, and men with long memories crossed paths. Fisher could feel the tension as soon as he walked through the door. The laughter was too loud. The glances lingered too long. Still, he followed Ben upstairs to a private box overlooking the stage. They sat back, trying to appear relaxed. Ben poured them each a drink, the amber liquid catching the gaslight. "You think they're watching us?" Ben asked quietly. Fisher didn't answer right away. He looked down at the crowded room below, the card tables, the glint of steel on men's belts, the uneasy faces. He nodded once. "Yeah," he said softly. "They're watching." Hours earlier, whispers had already spread through San Antonio that Ben Thompson was back in town. He had unfinished business. Months before, Thompson had been in a violent argument at the same theater that left a man dead. Friends of that man had sworn revenge. Everyone knew they'd been waiting for Ben to return, and they were ready. Fisher didn't know all the details. He wasn't part of that feud, but loyalty ran deep in his bones. If his friend was walking into danger, he wasn't going to let him walk alone. As the minutes passed, the noise from the stage faded behind the pounding of their hearts. Fisher's instincts screamed that something was wrong. The hair on his neck stood up. Then came the sound. Boots on the stairs. Slow. Heavy. More than one pair. Ben looked up, his hand drifting toward his holster. "It's time," he muttered. The door burst open. Gunfire exploded in the narrow room. The first bullet shattered the oil lamp, plunging the box into flickering shadows. Fisher reached for his pistols, but the attackers were already inside. 5 men, maybe more. The air filled with smoke and thunder. Sparks lit the darkness like lightning trapped indoors. Fisher fired once, twice, each shot loud, precise, desperate. A man fell against the wall screaming, but there were too many. A bullet tore through Fisher's shoulder. Another hit his side. He staggered, tried to rise, but another round slammed into his chest. Across the room, Ben Thompson had been hit almost instantly. He never even cleared his gun from the holster. He went down hard, a flash of pain crossing his face before everything went still. Fisher dropped to one knee, blood pooling beneath him, his vision blurring. The smoke choked his lungs, but he kept fighting. He fired until the cylinder clicked empty, until the strength left his arm. Then silence. Outside, the crowd below had heard the shots. Panic broke out in the theater. People screamed, tables overturned, boots pounded toward the doors. Some claimed they saw shadows running from the upper balcony, men slipping out into the night. But by the time anyone reached the box, it was too late. King Fisher lay beside his friend, his pistols empty, his body riddled with bullets. 13 shots, they would later say. 13 wounds for a man who had once ruled by the gun. His face, even in death, was calm. The expression of a man who had fought his last fight standing. The law arrived minutes later, but the killers were gone. No one confessed. No one was punished. Justice vanished into the same smoke that had filled the room. Word of the ambush spread through Texas by sunrise. By the time the story reached Uvalde, Sarah Fisher knew before anyone told her. She stood on the porch of their home, the morning wind tugging at her dress, staring down the long, empty road. The man she had waited for, the man who had promised to return by the weekend, was never coming home. Neighbors came to comfort her, but there were no words that could touch that kind of grief. King Fisher had lived like a storm, and the storm had finally taken him. In the days that followed, San Antonio buzzed with rumors. Some said the ambush had been planned by men loyal to the theater's owner, seeking revenge for the earlier shooting. Others whispered that jealous rivals had arranged it. Fearing what Fisher and Thompson represented, 2 deadly men who had learned to walk the line between good and evil. But no matter who fired the guns that night, everyone agreed on one thing: King Fisher never ran. He faced death the way he faced life, head-on, without fear. His body was carried back to Uvalde. The whole town turned out to see the sheriff's coffin arrive. Men removed their hats. Women wept. Children watched silently as the flag-covered box passed down the street. At the cemetery, the preacher spoke of redemption, of courage, of the strange path that led a sinner to salvation. Sarah stood by his grave, holding their daughters close. The wind blew softly through the mesquite trees. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, a lone echo across the open Texas land, and just like that, the legend of King Fisher came to rest. He had begun life as a boy without a name, become an outlaw with one feared across the border, and died wearing the badge of honor he once defied. Some called it irony. Others called it justice, but those who knew him best simply said this: he lived hard, he fought fair, and when the end came, he didn't turn away. 13 bullets ended the man, but not the legend. In the Wild West, stories like his never die. They ride on the wind, waiting to be told again. The news of King Fisher's death spread across Texas like wildfire. From dusty ranches to crowded saloons, men paused their card games, set down their whiskey glasses, and whispered the same words again and again. King Fisher is dead. No one could believe it. Not the lawmen who had once feared him. Not the ranchers who had trusted him. And not the outlaws who had cursed his name. The man who had outshot the border gangs, who had tamed Uvalde County, who had survived every bullet life had thrown his way, was gone. The legend had fallen. But his story was only beginning. In San Antonio, people talked about that night for weeks. Some said it was justice finally catching up with him. Others called it cold-blooded murder. Every version of the story changed slightly with each retelling. Who fired first? How many men there were? What Fisher said before he died? The truth blurred like smoke in the wind. One thing was certain. He never begged, never ran, never surrendered. That single fact turned a man's death into a legend. Back in Uvalde, his funeral drew one of the largest crowds the town had ever seen. Cowboys, soldiers, townsfolk, and even a few former outlaws gathered to pay their respects. The preacher spoke softly, calling Fisher a man of courage, a man who found his way back from darkness. When the coffin was lowered into the ground, the sound of dirt hitting wood echoed through the quiet. A few men removed their hats, some bowed their heads, and a handful of old gunfighters stood at the edge of the crowd with tears they didn't try to hide. Sarah Fisher held her daughters close, her face pale but strong. She didn't cry in front of the people. She waited until everyone left. When the crowd was gone, she knelt beside the grave, pressed her hand against the cold stone and whispered, "You came home?" "John, just like you promised." For weeks after, folks in town told stories about him. They said he'd changed the borderlands, brought law to a place that had known only chaos. Some swore they'd seen him in their dreams, riding across the plains beneath the moonlight. Others said they heard a single gunshot at midnight near the cemetery, as if his spirit refused to rest. The papers called him the outlaw who became a lawman. To the people of Texas, he was something more, a symbol that even in the roughest soil, a man could grow a new life. In the months that followed, his name took root in every corner of the state. Writers, journalists, and travelers began retelling his story in newspapers and dime novels. Some made him a hero, others painted him as a villain. But the line between the two was thin, just like it had always been in his life. One book claimed he had killed over 30 men. Another said he never took a life unless he had to. A few stories exaggerated every detail, turning his ivory-handled pistols into golden ones, his ranch into a fortress, and his final stand into a full-blown gun battle worthy of the big screen. Truth didn't matter anymore. The legend was alive. Young cowboys started wearing their guns lower on their hips, saying they wanted to draw like King Fisher. Old rangers told campfire tales about the sheriff who used to be an outlaw. And in Mexico, the bandits who once feared his name spoke of him with a strange mix of respect and superstition. They said the man who had raided their camps now rode the wind itself, an invisible guardian watching the border. Somewhere between myth and memory, John Kingfisher became eternal. But for Sarah and her daughters, eternity didn't fill the empty chair at the table. Life had to go on. She sold part of the ranch to keep food on the table, teaching her children that their father had been more than the stories people told. "He made mistakes," she said softly, "but he tried to be better. That's what matters." Her words carried more truth than any book could print, because when all the legends faded and the Wild West grew quiet, what remained wasn't the number of gunfights or the count of enemies. It was the simple story of a man who tried to change and paid the price for it. Years later, travelers passing through Uvalde would visit his grave. The stone was small, the carving simple. John Kingfisher, 1853, 1884. No grand words. No mention of outlaw or sheriff. Just a name left to speak for itself. Sometimes an old ranch hand would leave a single bullet on the grave, a sign of respect for the man who once ruled the border with iron and pride. Others left flowers. A few left nothing but silence. And when the evening wind swept through the cemetery, some swore they could hear the faint jingle of spurs and the echo of a horse's hooves fading into the distance. Time went on. The West changed. Railroads came. Towns grew. The age of gunfighters ended. But the stories of men like King Fisher refused to die. They became part of the soil itself, woven into the identity of Texas. Even today, when people talk about redemption, courage, or the thin line between right and wrong, his name sometimes surfaces like dust from a forgotten trail. Because John King Fisher wasn't just a man. He was a mirror of the West itself, wild, violent, brave, and searching for redemption. They said King Fisher lived by the gun. But maybe, just maybe, he died trying to live by his heart. And that's what made him a legend. Time has a way of softening even the hardest edges. Decades passed since that night in San Antonio, and the world that King Fisher once ruled began to fade into memory. The cattle trails turned into highways. The wild border towns grew into cities. The gunslingers were gone, replaced by businessmen and sheriffs with suits instead of six-shooters. But one name still hung in the Texas wind, King Fisher. To some, he was the hero who tamed a violent land. To others, he was just another killer who got lucky, and somewhere in between lived the truth. Historians have argued for years about what kind of man John King Fisher really was. The records are thin, the stories mixed with rumor, and the legends have grown taller with every retelling. Some newspaper clippings call him the gentleman, outlaw. Others describe him as the terror of the Nueces, strip, the truth, like most things in the wild. West depends on where you're standing. If you ask the ranchers of Uvalde, they'll tell you he was the sheriff who kept their cattle safe, a man who brought order when chaos ruled. He punished thieves, stopped raids, and gave people the courage to sleep at night. They remember the lawman, the calm voice, the steady eyes, the man who believed that justice should be swift but fair. But if you cross the Rio Grande and ask the families who lost loved ones to his raids, they'll tell a different story. They'll speak of fear, of midnight attacks, of a young outlaw who brought fire to their doorsteps. To them, King Fisher wasn't a hero. He was the storm itself. Even in death, he divided the frontier. Writers of dime novels in the early 1900s painted him as a Robin Hood of the borderlands, an outlaw with manners, a killer with a code. They described his charm, his sharp clothes, his ivory-handled pistols. In those pages, he was larger than life, standing tall against injustice, defending the poor, and fighting corruption. But not everyone believed in that romantic image. Some historians later uncovered court documents, letters, and eyewitness reports that told a rougher story. They showed a man who made money from stolen cattle, who led violent raids, who carried the scars of his own choices. So which version is true? The hero or the criminal? The sheriff or the sinner? Maybe both. King Fisher's life was a reflection of the time he lived in, a world that didn't fit into neat boxes of right or wrong. Texas in the 1870s was wild land, half law, half chaos. A man could be an outlaw one year and a lawman the next, depending on who held the power. Fisher simply adapted. He did what he had to do to survive, to protect his name, to defend what he thought was his. He lived by a simple rule. You don't cross me, and I won't cross you. For him, that was justice. For others, it was tyranny, and maybe that's what makes his story so human. Because deep down, King Fisher wasn't a saint or a monster. He was a man trying to find balance in a world that offered none. He wanted respect but took it by force. He wanted peace but found it only in violence. He wanted to be good, but he never quite escaped the shadow of who he'd been, even today. When you visit the small museum in Uvalde, you'll find a faded photograph of him. Dark hair neatly combed, mustache sharp, wearing a fine vest and a confident smirk. The eyes seem alive, steady, knowing. Beneath the photo is a short plaque that simply reads, John King Fisher, 1853 to 1884, outlaw and lawman. That single sentence captures everything. He was both. He had to be. Tourists often stand there reading the words twice, unsure of how to feel. Some leave inspired, others leave unsettled, but everyone leaves remembering him. What keeps his story alive isn't just the gunfights or the fame. It's the questions he left behind. Can a man truly change? Can the sins of the past ever be washed away by good deeds? And when does justice turn into vengeance? King Fisher's life forces us to face those questions, just as he faced them himself. Old Texans still tell his story around campfires. They describe how he rode his land with pride, how his laughter could fill a saloon, and how he stood his ground when death came calling. They tell their children that even the fiercest man can seek redemption, that sometimes It's the ones who've seen the darkest nights who understand the value of light. And every so often, when the evening wind sweeps through the desert, carrying the scent of mesquite and dust, people say you can still hear the faint rhythm of hooves. They say it's Kingfisher, riding across the plains, not as an outlaw or a lawman, but as something else entirely, a reminder. Because the legend of Kingfisher isn't just about a man who lived by the gun. It's about the eternal fight inside every person, the battle between right and wrong, pride and humility, past and future. He died more than a century ago, but his story still rides beside us, whispering the same truth. No one is all good or all bad. We're just men trying to survive our own choices. Some call him a hero, others call him a killer, but Texas remembers him as both, the outlaw who became the law and the man whose legend will never fade. The wind over the Texas plains still carries whispers of men like Kingfisher, names that lived, fought, and faded into legend. But legends aren't just stories from the past, they're mirrors held up to the present. And the life of Kingfisher still asks the same question that haunted him till the end. Can a man truly change? Kingfisher's life was a circle, beginning in chaos, crossing through redemption, and ending in tragedy. He started as a restless boy chasing power. He became a feared outlaw, ruled by pride and survival. Then, against every odd, he found love, faith, and peace. For a time, he believed he'd escaped his past. He wore the badge of a sheriff, protected families, and restored the law in a land that had forgotten what law meant. But the West had a cruel way of reminding men who they used to be. And when the bullets found him in San Antonio, they didn't just kill the man. They tested the idea that anyone can ever truly leave their past behind. That's the moral buried deep inside his legend. Fisher's story isn't just about gunfights and outlaws. It's about choices. Every decision he made, every fight, every truce, every moment of mercy or violence, built the road that led him to his fate. He wasn't born a villain and he didn't die a saint. He was both at once, caught in the struggle between darkness and light that lives inside every person. We like to think the world is simple. Good versus evil, law versus crime, right versus wrong. But Fisher's life shows us it's never that clear. Sometimes the outlaw becomes the law. Sometimes the sinner protects the innocent. And sometimes the man who saves others can't save himself. When people hear his story, they often ask, why didn't he just run? He had a family, a home, a chance at peace. Why walk back into danger? Maybe because men like Kingfisher can't run from who they are. He wasn't chasing fame or gold in those final days. He was chasing closure. He wanted to stand beside his friend, Ben Thompson, and face whatever came. Loyalty meant more to him than life itself. That's another lesson his story leaves behind. True loyalty comes with a price, and real courage isn't about living without fear. It's about standing firm when fear comes for you. The people who tell his story today see it as a warning and a reminder. It warns that violence always leaves scars, even when done for justice. It reminds us that even broken men can do good things, and even good men can make terrible mistakes. Kingfisher never claimed to be perfect. He just wanted to be better. And maybe that's the most human thing about him. Imagine him one last time, riding his horse at sunset, the light turning the dust to gold. His pistols hang low, but his hands are steady. He's not chasing anyone now, not running from the law or the past. He's just moving forward, 1 mile at a time, the horizon wide open before him. That's how the storytellers see him, not as a ghost, but as a symbol. A reminder that no matter where we start, redemption is always worth the fight. In the end, Fisher's life gives us more than a tale of the Wild West. It gives us a reflection of our own. We all carry regrets. We all make choices we wish we could undo. But like Kingfisher, we can try to build something good out of the wreckage. We can choose to stand, to forgive, to change, even if the world never forgets our mistakes. Maybe that's why people still speak his name after more than a century. Because he represents the struggle that never ends, the fight to be better than the man we were yesterday. He reminds us that redemption isn't about erasing the past, it's about owning it. He didn't deny what he had done. He faced it head on, and though he died young, he left behind something that many men never find. A legacy. Not a perfect one, not a clean one, but a real one. Today, when travelers pass through Uvalde, some stop at his grave. They read his name carved into the stone and wonder what kind of man he really was. A hero, a sinner, a mix of both. And then they move on, leaving behind a quiet moment of respect for someone who lived boldly, fought fiercely, and died standing tall. Because in the end, that's the moral of Kingfisher's story. We can't control how the world remembers us, only how we live while we're here. Kingfisher's guns have long been silent, but the echo of his choices still rides through the Texas hills. His life tells us that redemption isn't found in legend, it's found in the trying. And that trying, no matter how late, is worth everything. The years rolled by and the Wild West slowly faded into memory. The guns fell silent, the dusty trails turned into paved roads, and the outlaws who once ruled the frontier became names in history books. But one name refused to vanish with time. Kingfisher. More than a century after his death, people still speak it with a mix of awe and wonder. The name of a man who lived between two worlds, the outlaw and the lawman, the sinner and the savior. In Uvalde, Texas, where the wind still moves gently across the plains, old-timers tell his story the same way their fathers did, with a quiet respect and a touch of disbelief. They say that if you stand by his grave at sunset, when the light turns the sky to gold, you can almost feel him there. Watching, listening, riding the horizon that never ends. Children grow up hearing the tales of how he once ruled the border, how he turned his back on crime, how he wore a badge and tried to make peace with a land that didn't understand peace. To them, he's not just a figure from the past. He's a symbol of strength, of second chances, of what it means to fight your own nature and still come out standing. Historians call him the man who bridged the two sides of Texas. They write about how he fought to bring order to chaos, how his leadership kept towns safe when the law had no power. But they also write about his raids, his feuds, and the blood that followed him everywhere he went. He remains a puzzle even now. Part hero, part villain, a contradiction that defines the spirit of the frontier itself. Some museums display his portrait beside those of famous lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Pat Garrett, while others place him among the great outlaws of the era, men like Billy the Kid and Jesse James. And maybe that's exactly where he belongs, right in the middle, because Kingfisher's story isn't about choosing sides. It's about walking the fine line between them and surviving long enough to make people remember your name. The town of Uvalde never forgot him. His grave in Pioneer Cemetery became a quiet landmark, visited by travelers, historians, and dreamers. Some come looking for answers. Others come simply to pay respects. The inscription is simple: John Kingfisher, 1853 to 1884. No titles, no judgment, no label of outlaw or sheriff, just a name. And maybe that's the point, to let the man speak for himself through the silence of the Texas soil. Over time, filmmakers and writers found him again. His story appeared in documentaries, novels, and songs. Actors played him in short westerns, artists painted him under stormy skies, and storytellers revived his name on radio and screen. Each version told a little truth and a little myth, but together, they kept his spirit alive. To some, he became the symbol of redemption, the proof that even the wildest heart can find peace. To others, he became the warning that no matter how far you run, the past never stops following, and in that contrast lies the power of his legend. The people who still speak of him say his story isn't really about guns or fame. It's about transformation. It's about the belief that even in a broken world, change is possible. Kingfisher lived hard, loved fiercely, and died standing beside a friend. He didn't die rich. He didn't die famous. But he died true to who he was. Loyal, fearless, and unashamed. That's why his name still rides the wind today. If you travel across the Texas borderlands and stop by an old saloon or a weather-beaten ranch, you might hear a story told in a low voice about a man in a fine vest and bright pistols who rode alone at sunset, a man who once ruled by fear but ended by faith, a man who lived the kind of life you can't forget, no matter how much time has passed. They say his spirit still moves through the canyons, still whispers to those who listen. Maybe it's just the wind, or maybe it's something more. The voice of a man who refused to be erased. Every legend leaves behind a lesson. For Kingfisher, it's this: you are not only what you were, you are what you choose to become. He chose to change. He chose to protect instead of destroy. And though fate struck him down, it couldn't bury his story. Because stories like his belong to everyone who's ever wanted to rise above their past. The outlaw became the sheriff. The sinner became the protector. And in the end, the man became the legend. His name was John Kingfisher, and his story will ride forever across the Texas sky. The story of John Kingfisher doesn't end with his death in that San Antonio theater. Because men like him don't just die, they become part of the land itself. The wind that sweeps across Texas still whispers his name. And the dust that settles on the old frontier still remembers the sound of his boots. He was born in chaos, raised in violence, and buried with honor. In between those moments, he lived a lifetime most men couldn't imagine. As both the hunter and the hunted, the lawbreaker and the lawman. Kingfisher was proof that redemption isn't a single moment. It's a road, long, lonely, and often paid for in blood. He didn't find peace by denying who he was. He found it by facing the truth and trying, even when trying cost him everything. In a time when right and wrong blurred together, he became something more than both. A man searching for meaning in a world built on survival. Some called him dangerous. Some called him brave. And maybe they were both right. But if history teaches us anything, it's this: a person can be many things at once. Fisher was a father, a husband, an outlaw, a sheriff, a sinner who tried to live like a saint. He showed us that people aren't trapped by what they've done, but by what they refuse to change. And though the world may forget his face, his story remains a mirror for every soul who's ever wanted to start again. Even now, his tale feels alive, not as a dusty memory of the Wild West, but as a timeless reminder that redemption is never too late. The roads we take may twist and turn, but they can still lead home if we have the courage to walk them. Kingfisher didn't leave behind treasure, no written memoir, no heroic speeches. What he left was something far rarer, a legacy carved from contradiction, the kind that makes you question your own reflection. He reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to keep riding, even when fear rides beside you. So when you think of the Wild West, don't just think of gunfights and saloons. Think of men like John Kingfisher, men who lived hard, loved deeply, and fought the storms inside themselves. If he were alive today, he probably wouldn't call himself a hero. He'd shrug off the title, tip his hat and say, "I just did what I had to." And maybe that's the truest kind of heroism, the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't ask for fame, just forgiveness. So tonight, as this story closes, imagine the Texas horizon stretching endlessly before him. A trail with no end. A sky that never darkens. That's where his spirit still rides. Not chained to his sins, not defined by his death, but free, like the wind over Uvalde. Like the legend of a man who tried to make wrong things right. And maybe that's why we still tell his story. Because deep down, we all want to believe what Kingfisher proved, that no matter where you come from, no matter what you've done, there's always one last road, one last ride toward redemption. He took that road until the very end. And long after his body fell, his story kept moving. Because legends never really die. They just change shape. They become lessons, echoes, and reminders of what it means to be human. He was called a killer, a sheriff, and a legend. But in the end, he was just a man who dared to change, and in doing so, became immortal.